Frank is at a doctor's appointment with his pregnant wife Leo, and everything looks fine, but when they get back to their apartment the whole place has been turned upside down, and Leo is furious because this is already the second time someone has gotten inside, and during the first break-in Frank's laptop was taken, and what bothers her most right now is how unbothered he looks standing in the middle of it all, and the frustration becomes too much and she walks out on him. Frank goes to find his old friend Ben and tells him what happened, and the first thing Ben asks is whether the key is still where it is supposed to be, and Frank admits he has not checked, and Ben tells him he needs to be honest with Leo about whatever is going on, and Frank says he cannot do that to her 2 weeks before she gives birth, and the conversation ends there without a resolution. The next day Frank is doing an inspection at a building for work when he suddenly falls from height, and he catches himself just in time and looks up to find a colleague named Stanislas walking away from the spot where the fall was caused, and Frank goes after him but loses him, and the fear that runs through him after that is immediate and sharp, and he calls Leo and gets no answer and goes straight home and does not settle until he sees her standing there safe. Across the city that same day a man named Vanakin tracks Stanislas down and kills him. And whatever Frank stumbled onto at work has already started moving faster than he realizes. That night Frank climbs to the roof of his building and retrieves a key he had stashed there, and he decides the roof is no longer safe enough so he hides it in the drain of the bathroom sink, and Leo walks in and finds him acting strangely and he is about to explain when someone starts hammering on the front door, and Frank goes completely still and tells her not to make a sound, and a moment later masked men force their way into the apartment. The two of them fight back and hold their ground longer than anyone would expect, but there are too many men and Leo eventually retreats to the bathroom to try to ambush them from there, and they overpower her, bind her, and pull her out, and their leader Vanakin gets close to Frank and tells him very calmly that unless he reveals where the key is hidden they will kill his unborn child, and Frank says nothing. And Vanakin has him knocked out cold before taking Leo and leaving. The film moves back 10 years, a younger Frank has just graduated into the GIGN, France's elite counterterrorism unit, and after the ceremony his closest friend Nico introduces him to his family, and Leo's mother is there congratulating them both and mentioning proudly that her daughter is the only woman in the unit, and Frank's commanding officer pulls him aside and tells him his late father was one of the finest climbers the unit ever produced and that Frank clearly inherited that same ability, and he hands Frank his father's old patch with the Latin phrase Adviitam stitched into it, meaning for life, and Frank puts it on. The team trains together without any softness, grinding through hand-to-hand combat and climbing and shooting in tactical scenarios until every response becomes automatic, and 2 years into it Ben arrives as a junior recruit and Frank helps bring him along. And one night the whole group goes out and in a quieter moment Ben tells Leo he was adopted and that he has no desire to find his biological parents because they made their decision when they left him, and then Nico starts singing and the entire table collapses into laughter, and the night becomes one of those evenings that sticks. Over the years that follow Frank and Leo grow closer in the way people do when they share the same dangerous world, and one evening they finally find a moment alone together and Ben comes crashing in needing to be sick and ruins the whole thing, and Nico and his wife Manon tease Frank about it for days, and even when he tries again they catch him and start all over. One afternoon someone jokes that Frank and Leo will probably have a baby next and Leo shuts it down without hesitation, saying she did not put herself through years of training to end up living a domestic life, and Frank agrees with her, but later Nico and Manon sit with him and push back gently, and Frank opens up about losing his father at 8 years old and says he does not want a child of his own to grow up carrying that same absence, and Nico listens and then tells him that his wife and his children are not a distraction from the work. They are the reason he fights to come back from it, and for Nico family is not a weakness, it is everything. 9 years pass and Frank's team is returning from a mission when Leo calls, and before she can get the words out another call interrupts, and it is Eric, a friend who works the door at the Trinon Hotel, and Eric says he heard gunshots inside and does not know what to do, and Frank tells him to stay put and calls his superior who orders him to wait outside for backup. And Frank waits just long enough to decide he cannot stand there while people might be dying inside, and he goes in. Inside the hotel the team encounters 2 men in suits trying to get out and the situation breaks open immediately, and in a firefight that follows Nico takes a bullet in the neck and Ben's leg is hit so badly it will never work the same way again, and one of the gunmen grabs a woman and uses her as cover, and Nico bleeding heavily still manages to shoot one of the attackers to protect Ben, and Frank kills the other and gets the woman out, and then he stays on the floor beside Nico and watches his best friend bleed out and cannot stop it. The next morning Frank is let go for disobeying a direct order, with the official position being that his decision caused 1 death and 1 permanent injury, and he clears out his things and finds his father's patch and holds it, and he goes to where Manon and the team are mourning and walks in and breaks in front of her and tells her he is sorry, and at the funeral Manon speaks about who Nico was. And afterward Frank finds Nico's young son Lulu and tells him quietly that he can always reach out if he needs someone, and on the way home he learns that Leo is handing in her resignation as well. At home she tells him she wants something quieter for them, and Frank, still raw from losing Nico, tells her that is not what he wants, that he has no interest in settling into ordinary life and having children, and the words come out harder than he intends and he cannot take them back. Later at Ben's place they watch the news coverage of the hotel incident and the report describes the two dead men as ordinary thieves, and Ben says that is impossible because the way those men moved and handled their weapons was far beyond what any thief would know, and he also tells Frank the damage to his leg is permanent and that he has been let go, and Frank starts taking the blame and Ben stops him and says if he had genuinely believed the mission was wrong he would have spoken up at the time. The next day Leo tells Frank she is pregnant, and something in him shifts completely and quietly, and the two of them find a place they love and move in together, and while they are settling in Frank notices that his father's patch has blood on it from one of the men at the hotel, and he sends the sample off to a forensic institute without telling anyone. And when the results come back the doctor warns him not to tell anyone where the sample came from, and the tone of that warning makes clear that something very large is sitting behind all of this, and Frank learns that the dead man was a former Special Forces operative with documented connections to the DGSI, France's domestic intelligence agency. Ben tells him to walk away from it, but Frank locks the blood-stained patch in a secure locker, hides the key on the roof, and keeps the information to himself. Months later Frank and Leo host a birthday party for Lulu, and afterward Manon tells Frank that Lulu is coping but her other son, Antoine, is refusing to speak to anyone, and when Frank approaches Antoine the boy erupts because he overheard enough to know that Frank has information about who was actually responsible for his father's death and has been keeping it to himself, and the guilt that has been accumulating in Frank finally reaches a point where he cannot carry it alone. And he contacts a journalist and tells her he has evidence that could expose people inside the government, and she promises to protect him, and she is already working for the people he is trying to expose. 7 months before all of this a CIA operative and his bodyguard came to France to negotiate an arms deal with Australia, and 2 men connected to the DGSI were sent to steal documents from them, and the operative caught them and a fatal confrontation followed, and now a minister has been told that Frank is holding evidence capable of bringing down everyone involved, and the order is given to eliminate him. And Vanaken is the one assigned to do it. Back in the present Vanaken reaches Frank by video call and gives him 4 hours to deliver the patch or Leo will not survive, and he tells Frank the police cannot help him because Frank has already been framed, and Vanaken's team had planted Frank's fingerprints on the weapon used to kill Stanislas days earlier, and Frank is dropped on an empty road with a phone to wait for instructions. He finds a place to clean up and makes his way back to the apartment. And the whole building is surrounded by police, but Frank scales the outside and gets in and goes straight to the bathroom drain and finds it empty, the key already taken, and before he can figure out his next move the police spot him inside and he is forced into a chase that takes him across rooftops and through streets before he finally loses them. He finds Ben at a gym and puts everything on the table, and Ben does not think about it before saying he is in, and the two of them build a plan together. And Frank takes Ben's patch and marks it with his own blood to use as a decoy, and before he leaves he hides a tracking device inside his boot and leaves Vanaken's phone with Ben so it cannot be used to locate him, and he goes alone to meet Vanaken. The moment Frank arrives he is tied up, and when Vanaken demands the patch Frank refuses to give anything until he sees Leo, and they take him to her and she is bound but alive, and Frank tells them the patch is in the seat of his motorbike, and Vanaken goes and retrieves the decoy and looks it over. And then instead of letting them go he orders one of his men to put a farewell message on Frank's phone to make the whole thing look like something it was not, and it becomes obvious Frank was never going to walk out of those woods, but the police have been tracking the signal from the boot and are already moving toward the forest, and before the order can be carried out Ben arrives and takes down Vanaken's men and gets Frank and Leo out, and the 3 of them get into a car and drive hard with Vanaken right behind them, and during the chase Leo is hit in the arm and Frank ties the wound off with his belt and tells her to stay with him. And then her contractions start, and Frank keeps his voice completely steady and tells her their baby is going to be fine, and he tells Ben to get her to the hospital and jumps out of the moving car alone. Vanaken splits his attention between chasing Ben and dealing with the police who are now closing in from multiple directions, and Frank takes a bike from an officer and gets on the radio to call for support and draws Vanaken's pursuit away from the hospital, And the chase runs until Vanaken sees the police numbers growing and breaks off, and Frank spots a paraglider sitting in a nearby field and uses it to get out of reach while the officers below try to make sense of what just happened. Ben is driving hard toward the hospital with Leo on. Ben is racing to the hospital with Leo in the back from blood loss and his own wounds getting worse, and Vanaken has been following the phone Frank left in the car and intercepts them and opens fire again and pulls everything back into chaos, and the GIGN is finally mobilized and starts moving, and Frank watches from outside as Ben gets Leo through the hospital entrance. And then Vanaken corners Ben inside and raises his weapon. Landing directly on top of Vanaken, Frank unleashes a relentless barrage of blows, refusing to stop until Vanaken drifts into unconsciousness. And the GIGN orders him to stand down and he does not, and he is arrested shortly after Leo is taken into care. Weeks later Leo walks into the prison visiting room with their newborn daughter, and Frank sees his daughter for the first time, and Leo tells him what she did. Because during the attack at the apartment when Vanaken's men were pulling her out she had already quietly slipped the real key out of the drain and hidden it on herself, and with Ben's help afterward she handed the genuine blood-stained patch over to the authorities, and everything on it was enough to prove Frank's innocence and expose what was actually behind the hotel shooting 9 years ago, and the judge rules in his favor and he is released. Frank and Leo walk out together with their daughter, from across the room looking like a man who knows he did the right thing. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video like this.